Hi, this is Gabriel from the Cayman Islands. Today I want to ask, did Castro use Santeria to control Venezuela? Well, this is an interesting question. The separation of church and state is a major milestone of modernity and the Enlightenment. Yet, I think it's doubtful that religion will ever be truly separated from politics. I mean, after all, political life is full of uncertainties and risks, and this makes it fertile ground for religious beliefs and practices. At least in the West, modern politicians are under immense pressure not to mingle in religious businesses in their public appearances. So many are happy to give the appearance of being thoroughly secular in their political activities. But in the midst of anxieties over being assassinated or losing an election, many politicians in their private lives will be more inclined to mingle with gods, spirits, and occult forces. Indeed, anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski, he famously claimed that people become more interested in magic whenever they face a stressful situation. For instance, the Trobriand Islanders, which Malinowski studied, they would undergo very complicated rituals whenever they planned to sail in the turbulent ocean waters, but they would not perform such rituals whenever they planned to sail in the calm lagoon waters. So, under stress, human beings typically attempt to increase control over their own affairs, and one way of doing so is by appealing to practices related to magic. Now, anthropologists have long warned that, in fact, it is not all that easy to separate magic from religion, because ultimately, both magic and religion engage in rituals in order to achieve some increased measure of control. Now, be that as it may, the fact is that whether we want to call it magic or religion, many rulers will always be susceptible to the influence of some advisors who purport to tell them how they can best proceed to gain the factor or the favor of mysterious supernatural entities. For instance, Queen Elizabeth I, she had John Dee. Tsarina Alexandra had Rasputin. Nancy Reagan had her own astrologer, and maybe even her husband may have also been influenced by astrological advice when he was president. South Korea's Park Geun-hye was impeached recently because she seemed to be under the extreme influence of a cult leader. So, in all these cases, there was outcry over the influence of charlatans in political decision-making. Sages who claim to be a portal to the mysterious world of the unseen will always find a way to manipulate the superstitious people in power for their own advantage. And in turn, unscrupulous politicians will also use the occult in order to manipulate their own superstitious subjects. So, for instance, François Duvalier, the president of Haiti some decades ago, the dictator, he organized the Tonton Macoute, which was a militia that would terrorize civilians, under the belief that Duvalier himself was invested with supernatural power. Now, less frequently, one head of state may use the occult to manipulate another head of state. And apparently, well, this seems to account, at least partly, for Cuba's astonishing control of Venezuela over the last 20 years. As early as 1993, renowned journalist Andres Oppenheimer was reporting that Fidel Castro was taking Cuba into a new religious direction. Now, Castro was nominally an atheist on account of his Marxism, and he persecuted Christians as soon as he reached power. However, underneath the Christian appearance, Cuba has also been deeply influenced by Santeria for many centuries. And Santeria, of course, it's a religion that syncretizes elements of Christianity and traditional African religions. Castro did not have a high opinion of Santeros because in the way he understood the things given his Marxist leanings. Santeros, they also represented the irrationality of a barbarous past. But once the Soviet Union collapsed, Castro realized that he needed an alternative source of support to stay in power, and he found it in Santeros. So he reached out to at least half of Cuba's babalaos. The babalaos are Santeria priests, and he brought them under his favor. In turn, they would report to Cuban authorities any subversive activities that they may find suspicious. So essentially, the babalaos became spies. Castro also set his eyes on Venezuela. Now, as early as 1967, he had implanted guerrilla movement there to no avail. In later years, Venezuela was a prized commodity because in Castro's calculation, its huge oil revenue could fill the void left by Soviets after they removed aid. Now, the opportunity for Castro came in the 1990s when Hugo Chavez tried to seize power forcefully in Venezuela. Castro was aware that Chavez had leftist sympathies, but according to journalist David Placer, Castro lured Chavez through religious practices and not just leftist ideology. Chavez had long had a bent for divination practices, and apparently he had an interest in being initiated in Santeria, which requires various stages of initiation, and there is a whole aura of secrecy surrounding Santeria. So Castro mobilized his babalaos, and he made sure that Chavez would feel comfortable with them. And in turn, these babalaos served as spies, providing valuable information to Castro, who used this information as a way to gain influence over Chavez and thus cement Cuba's control over Venezuela. Now, unlike Oppenheimer, Placer is not a fully reliable journalist. And in fact, if you read his book, it's colored with great sensationalism. So everything that Placer reports must be taken with a grain of salt. But it does appear that ever since Chavez reached power in 1998, the number of Cuban babalaos increased significantly in Venezuela. According to Placer, once in power, Chavez engaged in constant Santeria rituals, all with the purpose of seeking the Orishes. These are the Santeria spirits. He was trying to seek their assistance to indefinitely stay in office. One of Placer's biggest allegations is that Chavez exhumed Simón Bolívar's remains. Remember that Bolívar is Venezuela's national hero. And apparently Chavez did this. He unburied Bolívar's body as part of a macabre ritual that sought to transfer the 19th century's hero's power to Chavez. Now, the exhumation did take place, and in fact, it was broadcast on national TV. But Chavez claimed that his intent was to investigate whether or not Bolívar had been poisoned by his enemies. Placer argues that this was just a cover for the real meaning of the ritual. Now, Placer's journalistic style is very gossipy, and many of his claims are done in a style that is typical of conspiracy theorists. For example, he claims that Venezuelan banknotes are full of Santeria symbols, not unlike the claims of American conspiracy theorists, who claim that the dollar bill has Masonic symbols as well, and that somehow proves that some Masonic lodge is really calling the shots in Washington. Baloney. So I would say that it is very difficult to assess the veracity of Placer's allegation. Now, it is beyond doubt that Castro was a very skillful manipulator who was willing to go great lengths in order to seize control of Venezuela. And it is also true that in order to increase his grip to power in Cuba, he catered to local santeros. But as far as I can see, there is not enough evidence to sustain the claim that Castro used Santeria in order to manipulate Chavez. It's only a tentative hypothesis. Chavez's private religious beliefs were always a mystery, so we're not really sure. And this is in large measure because in his populist style, he liked to play along with all religious beliefs wherever he went in order to please crowds. Of course, that's what populists do, right? Now, we do know more about the religious beliefs of Chavez's successor and mentee, the current president, Nicolás Maduro. For a time, Maduro was a disciple of Satya Sai Baba, the Indian guru who we now know was unashamedly manipulative of his followers. Maduro also had some singular mystical inclinations. He claimed that the spirit of Chavez spoke to him through a bird, and he also claimed that Chavez's facial image makes appearances in stains on the wall of Caracas subway station. Now, sadly, Maduro, not being a highly educated person, is obviously unaware of what pareidolias are. But anyways, so Maduro was chosen as a successor by Chavez largely because the Cubans saw him as someone they could work with. The other candidate for succession was Diosdado Cabello, and Cabello is far more competent than Maduro, but the issue was that the Cubans do not trust him. So if we bring together Maduro's greater inclination to superstition, the way he's being manipulated by other people, and Cuban sympathies for him, then perhaps a stronger case could be made that indeed Santeria may be a factor in Cuba's control of Venezuela. However, when it comes to this argumentation, I think one word of caution is in order. It has become too easy for us Westerners to claim that Santeria and other African cults are based on superstition, whereas Christianity has nothing of the sort. Now, this view is deeply ethnocentric, and unfortunately, I think it underlies many of Placer's claims. Because from a strictly rationalist point of view, the exhumation of Bolivar's remains in order to be imbued with his powers, as Chavez did, that is as superstitious as preserving the relics of some medieval saint in Christianity. By the same token, Maduro claims communication with Chavez via birds, but let us not forget that George W. Bush once said that God told him to invade Iraq. So I would say here that one man's religion is definitely another man's superstition. Now, the real reason for concern should not be superstitious behavior as such, but rather the way clever politicians control weaker-minded politicians through their own superstitions. And although we cannot be entirely sure, it does seem that Venezuela's misfortunes are indeed partly attributable to this lamentable dynamic that has been present ever since one man convinced another man that there was some supernatural realm.